Hi, welcome to the shed. This is one of my best places for thinking about the Bible, so I'm glad you can join me. There are characters and stories from the Bible with which many of us are familiar. The stories that become Sunday school favourites or cultural archetypes. Cain and Abel, David and Goliath, Jonah and the watery scaly thing. We go back to these stories because they are iconic and pack in great truths. They are deserving of their attention. But in this series, we're going to take some of these stories and look at the circumstances and characters that immediately precede or follow the parts that we know well. I want to see how that additional context can enhance the stories we know, and how we can be enriched by digging deeper into the Bible and connecting what we sometimes think of as singular stories to a broader, more holistic view of God's big story. This week, Lamech's Bad Poetry. In the Bible, we have many stories of our ancestors and stories of our God interacting with the world. And if you look outside of the Bible context too, there are countless stories of heroes, forebears, gods and kings. Humans love to tell stories, and I often think how strange it must have been to be amongst the early people groups of the world when the only stories you had were from your own tribe, and there weren't millennia of recorded writings to look back on. This is the kind of world Lamech lived in. He was just 5 generations from Cain. That's 6 from the beginning, according to Genesis. For Lamech, 2 stories must have loomed large. The story of creation and the tale of the first murder committed by Cain against his brother Abel. We know that Lamech was marked by that history because he talks to his wives about it. Actually, he doesn't just talk, he sings. You can see, even in translation, the poetic techniques he is using in his speech. Each set of 2 lines is a repetition. The second line of the set repeats and increases the intensity of the first. Ada, Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Each repetition here is an accumulatio, a doubling down on what he said in the previous line. But what does it mean that Lamech boasts of killing people that have wronged him? What does he mean when he says he is avenged 77 times? And is there anything significant about the fact that he speaks in verse? Earlier on in the chapter we read in the well-known bit about Cain and Abel.
He's all right. He's resting.
God promises Cain that he will protect him by giving him a mark on his head and vowing to avenge wrong done to him 7 times over. However, in this later portion, God isn't speaking. It's Lamech saying he will avenge himself 77 times. And murdering a boy just because he was insulted. Lamech is presenting to his wives a perverted version of God's justice. And like those that would build the Tower of Babel in the years that followed, Lamech is trying to take power into his own hands and be like God. Lamech references the story of his forebear Cain, but he also references the way God appears in the story of creation. Lamech is particular about using his voice here. He says, wives of Lamech, hear my words. So he can make this inverse declaration of self-claimed power. So he speaks, and he speaks in poetry, just as God did at creation. The other story that Lamech knew. By putting his speech into verse, the Old Testament writers are making his words into a parody of the Creator. The message here is that Lamech thinks he can be like God, thinks he can look after himself. His speech is a total and utter self-conscious rejection of all God's providence. No God, no, I'm going to do things my own way. I can be my own God. This is the passage that leads from the story of Cain and Abel. It's also the passage that leads into the flood. Lamech embodies the attitudes of rebellion and sinfulness that Noah escapes from in the ark. I used to think this was one of the saddest parts of the Bible. Adam and Eve fell because of temptation, Cain for jealousy, but Lamech falls for pride. He knows he's turning from God, and he does it willingly and consciously. If we truly stop to consider the implications of that, how wasteful it is, it's devastating. And yet, is Lamech really all that different from us? If anything, we know more of God than Lamech did, and yet we still sin, we still turn from him, we still go our own way, rely on our own power and build our own towers. What can Lamech's tragic story teach us? Firstly, there is warning. Lamech is the stark portrait of what we're really doing when we dig our heels in against God. The story also shows us the possible, far-reaching and unforeseen repercussions of what we do. We are made for community after all, and we kid ourselves if we think our personal iniquity does not affect those around us and those that come after us. Look what Cain's sin did to his descendant. But finally, within its broader context, this story also speaks of hope. The chapter we read finishes with the birth of Seth, a new creation in the midst of the old. And there is this line at the end, at that time people began to call in the name of the Lord. And we know from the famous story of Noah that's to come that God had a plan. He always has a plan. Maybe that's what the writers want to say to us today. Call on God, put down your own pride and call on his name. Lord, you are God. I need you to guide me. Perhaps in the story of Lamech is a call to see our own pride and an invitation to call on God's power instead of our own. See you next time.